Should you be removing seats and other parts from your customer's car? Maybe, maybe not. I'm Kevin Davis from Detailer's Helper. We'll be discussing that today. This is a topic that doesn't get discussed that much, but I was part of a Facebook group discussion the other day talking about seat removal, whether or not you should do it, whether or not you shouldn't do it, some of the risks, and I was part of that trying to discuss that, so I figured this would be a great topic to discuss for this video. I'm going to handle this a little bit differently. I've got some notes that I want to make sure I covered in this video, so appreciate your patience with me looking down at my notes instead of just making eye contact with the camera. So I also want to talk about my personal position. We'll talk about the risks of doing seat removal and other parts for sure. And some of the things that you may or may not have thought about, some of the things that you definitely need to address and take care of if you are doing it, and some of, like I said, my personal thoughts on whether or not to do it, which tend to agree with a lot of people that I've discussed this with that have been in the industry for very long and are risk averse like me. So let's talk about some reasons that you might want to do this, or the arguments there that most people give. I saw somebody that had said, if you call yourself a professional detailer, you absolutely should be removing seats. I vehemently disagree with that position. There's no basis to say that. I'm going to take that position. Whether or not you remove seats has nothing to do with whether or not you're a professional detailer. And I would actually argue that the contrary is true, that your professionalism and your business acumen is probably less if you have the stance that every single seat comes out of every single car. So let's talk about why you would do that. Obviously, the biggest argument is that you want to get crap from underneath the seats. If you're going to be a thorough detailer, then you want to make sure that you get everything cleaned and all of that. So that would be one reason. I contend that there's probably some reasons not to do that, even using that argument. The other reason would be something like flood recovery, where the carpet all has to come out and you have to be able to get to everything from that in order to do that, or some sort of gasoline spill, pepper spray, something like that, that would require you to clean at a level that's super deep and to be able to remove the seats to make that happen. And so those are some of the reasons why people say that they would do it. And again, I would argue that people that are doing flood recovery, those kind of things, actually have the skills and and have satisfied a lot of the things that we're going to talk about doing. So why would you not want to do this? This is a big contention of mine. I'm actually going to take the stance that in most cases, for most detailers, and I'm not going to say all detailers, all cases, because it's just not true, but in most cases for most detailers, there's no reason for you to be taking seats out or removing body panels. I'll talk about that in a second, or any other parts off the car. I just don't think it's necessary for most people to do it. And here's why I would say that. First of all, there are very few customers, I believe, that are willing to pay for the extra time, effort, and parts required to remove seats. It's a little bit, the way that I was thinking about it is a little bit when you're doing exterior stuff, there aren't a whole lot of customers that are going to pay for a 3-step absolute perfection paint correction. There just aren't that many out there. There are some, again, I'm not going to use words like all, but for most people, this is just not going to happen. And I think that there are most customers out there either A, don't care about what's underneath their seat, beyond what you can get using crevice tools, a little bit of acrobatics on your part, and some just good old-fashioned work. They're not going to care about the extra stuff that you can't get when you're using the normal techniques and tools that are available in the industry. And so what that means is, if you're doing it and the customer isn't willing to pay for it, then what we've talked about in almost every video that I do is that's going to affect your profitability, right? So if you are doing work that they're unwilling to pay for, then there's no reason. I'm going to just continue to hit on this, that there's no reason to do it. We talked a little bit in my last video about going above and beyond and all that, and this sort of falls in that category. If you're removing seats, whether it takes you 10 extra minutes or 30 extra minutes, I'm just going to say that it's probably not worth it if the customer is not willing to pay for it. And again, the percentage of people that not only require that type of service and are willing to pay for it are just small. So again, if it's flood recovery, those kind of works, then typically you're dealing probably with an insurance claim, which means it costs what it costs, and you've been given a budget that you can agree to or disagree to when you agree to do the job for the insurance company. So that's sort of a different set of math, but it still sits there because you're going to get profit from that because the insurance company is going to pay you to do it. It's cheaper for them to do that than to total the car or whatever. So that's one reason not to do it. In my mind, I think it's probably unnecessary. With our available steamers, extractors, tornadors, crevice tools, long crevice tools, that sort of thing, unless it's a very specific vehicle that is almost impossible to get to those areas, then I just think it's unnecessary. I don't think most customers are going to care about it, and I don't think that it needs to be done. I can get probably 95% of the stuff that needs to be done under seats just by doing a little bit of work and using the right tools. And so I don't think it's necessary for most cases. There may be a case to where if you can see it, but you can't get to it, then obviously that's a problem. But that's one of those things where you have to set the expectation for the customer and then deal with that accordingly. You know, there just may be some things that you can't get to, but in most cases, it's probably going to require customers' own acrobatics in order to see those places. So again, I'm sort of taking the stance that it's usually not necessary. The biggest reason that I'm going to continue to argue that you should not be taking seats out is it's too risky. Okay, so this is the same reason that most people would argue don't take, or you can take out kids' car seats. Take out car seats, but you never put them back in for the customer. Leave that up to their responsibility because it's just too risky. You may not do it right. There's all sorts of legal reasons not to do that. So let's talk about the risk involved and some of the mechanics involved with doing seat removal in particular. So in most cases, they have these things, and I appreciate Dylan reminding me about this, as they're torque to yield bolts, or you can also refer to them as single-use bolts, which is sort of a catch-all for that. But effectively, once those bolts go into the seats or into the body of the car to secure the seats, they are 100% supposed to be replaced. They're not to be reused. There are other car parts, car bolts that are the same way, head bolts and some other engine components that are not meant to be reused because they stretch, and then you're unable to get the torque specs done correctly once you put them back in. So basically, they're a throwaway part. So when you take those parts out, you have to replace them. So that would require you to do some different things. You want to make sure that you have your dealers on speed dial of every single make and model that you are going to work on, because you need to call the service department and get those single-use bolts. So obviously that can be a problem depending on what area you live in, depending on what they're stocking, depending on the age of the car that you're doing. Those bolts can also sometimes cost about $5 a piece, which is not a huge amount of money, but if you did 8 bolts, if there are 8 bolts between the two seats times that's $40. So depending on what you're charging per hour, that if the customer's not doing it, if you spend an hour and then spend $40 on the parts, that could be $100 that you've just given up in profit. I just don't think that makes any sense to do that. Obviously, you've got litigation. I started trying to find some average cost of defending a lawsuit, and I found one number, or a couple of different places that put the number somewhere around $50,000 to defend what I would call as a little bit frivolous litigation, but in this case, it's going to be litigation that you're going to have to defend. So it may cost you about $50,000 to defend that. In some cases, you've got the proper insurance that will sort of go to bat for you and defend your position on that against that litigation. So we'll talk about some of that in the, if you're going to decide to do it, what things you need to make sure of. But in some cases, though, it would not be difficult for them to prove negligence on your part, which means that you, through knowingly or through even unknowingly, that you are negligent in the duties and the responsibility to the customer to ensure their safety for your actions. That covers tons of different aspects of our daily lives, especially in professional jobs. But what I would assume would happen is that the attorney would try to prove that you were negligent. And there's some different things that you need to do in order to avoid that. And we'll talk about that again in a second. But one of the issues would be whether or not you have the proper skills, the proper tools, and the proper information in order to put those seats back in safely. Obviously when you're putting bolts in, there's a very critical thing, which is torque specs. You have to know what those bolts should be torqued to ensure that in the event of the crash, in the event of a crash, that those bolts would perform as they were designed. Modern cars especially are not just, thrown together. They're computer modeled. They know exactly what's going to happen in a crash. They've already tested those things that are going to happen in a crash. You put a 200-pound guy seatbelted into that seat, and if the bolts aren't torqued properly, or if they're over torqued, it's possible that the heads are going to pop off of that and send the guy through the windshield. I mean, there's all sorts of things that could happen in that case, but making sure that they're torqued correctly to the specs. That's the other reason you need your dealers on speed dial or a really good source for torque specs, which I was just looking up some stuff on on seats and bolts and torque to yield and all that. And there's not a heck of a lot of information that I could find. So it may be difficult to find the specific torque specs. And then you're going to need to document and prove that you actually did that. I don't know if that's going to require you take pictures of the torque wrench, if you take video of the torque wrench, if you sign off and date the individual torque specs that were used for those bolts, but you want to cover your butt in those cases in case there's litigation. So litigation is a huge issue. 50 grand may cost you. But a big component that I think that a lot of people might miss would be something like guilt. Let's say that you took somebody's seats out, put them back in, you think you've done everything right. Someone has a serious accident and a kid gets killed or just seriously injured as a result of that. I can't imagine personally ever being able to diffuse the guilt that I would feel even if I don't have 100% confidence that I was at fault. Even the doubt that I may have would really affect me greatly. And I think that that's something that a lot of guys don't take into consideration. That's another reason you don't mess with car seats. You just go and have the parents do it and make sure that you're not compromising their kids' safety. So guilt's another factor. And so again, all of those reasons, I'm going to say take the position that in most cases you shouldn't be taking seats out. So, but if you decide to do it, there are some things that I think you want to make sure of. Even if you're doing it for flood recovery or some of those kind of things, there are things that you really need to make sure you're doing. There's a guy on that particular group that talked about he was an ASC certified mechanic, which means that he's got training and certifications that show the customer that he does have the skills in order to do the work that he's setting forth, which may cover your butt a little bit. On the other side of things, if you screw it up, then that actually may hold you to a higher standard than some other people. There was a whole deal about doing CPR, and some of the lawsuits were out there, and what they showed was that people that were CPR certified were actually held to a higher standard for life-saving and or sticking with life-saving efforts than people that weren't. So it actually caused some people not to do CPR certifications for fear of lawsuits. Don't get me started on what's wrong with our legal system. This is just the way that it is. It's really stupid. Litigation under false pretenses costs our country billions of dollars every year. So another issue, but it's within the realm of things that we need to deal with. So I already talked about having the dealer on speed dial so you have access to those parts, those single-use bolts. You want to make sure you have the proper tools. That includes every level of torque wrench that you can have to ensure that you can meet those torques. Some may be torqued to 20 foot-pounds, which would be pretty low, and some may be 250 foot-pounds of torque. So that requires several different torque wrenches. You can't just get in there and do that. You may need star tools. You may that go on your torque wrench. You may need specialty, obviously metric and SAE bolt sizes are going to be required for the sockets and all that, but you may need some specialty tools on some of those. I've seen them with stars using the star tools and obviously Allen key type fittings and all that. So make sure you have all the proper tools. Torque specs on every single vehicle that you do, so you want to make sure that that information is available, which means when you're scheduling those, you need to know if you're going to do that and be able to gain that information. Also have the bolts. So the bolts are another thing. You want to make sure you have the single-use bolts in hand before you start it. Unless for some reason you're doing a flood recovery and you have, infinite time, you have a couple of weeks in order to get that done. But if a guy has to order them, it may take, a week to get those bolts in for a specialty vehicle. So you have to make sure you have those. The other thing is you want to make sure that you have adequate and verified insurance coverage. So if you have not had the conversation with your insurance agent that you're getting your liability insurance from and your garage keeper's insurance from, you want to make sure you have this specific conversation and say, this is what I'm doing. I need in writing to make sure that you may already have it in writing, and they may just point out a part of your policy where it says that, all the declarations page. But make sure that you are covered for that activity. Say, listen, here's what I do. I take seats out. These are the process that I follow. Am I going to be covered in the event of something happening? And will you cover my lawsuit defending costs if that happens to me, if somebody decides to sue me? Are you going to cover those costs as well? So that will mitigate your risk. So that's really key. That adds on to our previous discussions about insurance already. So make sure that those things are in place. And one big thing that you need to make sure you have is the customer base and customers that are willing to pay for it. I think that that's one of the biggest issues here. Beyond risk, this should answer whether or not you should do it in the first place. If people aren't willing to pay for it, you shouldn't be doing it, because it's just a waste of money. Like I said, I still think that you can get 95% of any dirt and grime from underneath the seats without taking the seats out. So, but if somebody's willing to pay for it and you follow all those guidelines, then definitely you're going to need to have customers that'll pay for it. Again, it's sort of like 3-step people that want 98 to 100% correction on their car. There's only so many guys willing to pay for that. And in a lot of cases, similar thing. You may not even need to do that level of correction in order to meet the expectations of the customer. So one other thing I want to talk about with this is I had seen some pictures where a guy had taken a hot rod and decided to take a hood off of it in order to detail it, which made no sense to me whatsoever. I've done thousands of hours of body work, paint work, and obviously detailing work, and I've never once thought that it would just be better if I took this panel off from a customer's car. If I'm working on my Cobra, I need to take the hood off because I need to work on the vents or something like that. That's my car. I can do whatever I want. I can take time to do it. If I scratch it, I'll fix it. For a customer's car, especially an older hot rod where the panel fitment has been like that in some cases for decades, I can't think of any reason to start taking the car apart in order to get those panels corrected. Again, there's probably ways to get underneath it. And, again, you might have to use some acrobatics in order to get the underside of the hood corrected or something like that. If your customer says it's okay and you have had the discussion with, hey, when we put this thing back on, if we scratch the paint on it, are you willing to take responsibility for that? Because let's say that it's a show car, right? It's got a $15,000 paint job. If you put a big scratch on the corner of that hood when you go to close it to check the gapping, then that's going to be on you. In a lot of cases, they can show, if it's a metallic paint job, 4-stage paint, pearl, that kind of stuff, you'll never get that paint matched again, which means you have to paint the whole car. And again, you may or may not have insurance coverage for that. So if you're going to do that, make sure you have coverage. One other note along those lines is when sort of justifying my position that when it's necessary, when it's not necessary to take things apart. So at what point do you stop? You start taking, the doors are really difficult to get to, the inside of the door. So do you start taking doors off? Do you start taking glass out so you can make sure you get that done and make sure the headliners are done correctly? Do you start pulling motors so that you can make sure that you get the motor 100% clean? Because engines are obviously difficult to reach, especially in small 4-cylinder vehicles, and some of the tight exotics are all, there's just no room in there. So at what point do you stop? So that's sort of my argument against whether or not it's necessary to do that. So if you're going to do it, make sure that you have all the requirements and all of your bases covered and understand the risks inherent even once those things are covered. But make sure you're going to get paid for it and make sure you understand exactly what's required before you do it. So love to hear your comments. Love to hear your discussion on that. I know that it's a controversial issue. I know that some people are very vehement about doing it. Hopefully this will make you think. And if you do decide to do it, make sure you have everything in line to make sure that's happening. So some exciting things happening in the helper brands. The Detailer's Helper obviously is my main brand that I deal with you guys. I've got 2 other new brands that are coming, Little Helper and The Helper, which are going to be specific to retail. So hopefully you'll start seeing my posts and stuff about that. If you've got some people in your lives that like to garden or do, go barbecuing or camping or anything, then we're doing a general purpose sort of belt out there to make that possible and to help people do that, which we're sort of targeting some major retailers to get that. We're targeting Toys R Us for the Little Helper, which will be a specific belt branded for kids and for toy stores and that sort of thing. So that's really exciting. If you do not currently own a Detailer's Helper, why not? We know for a fact it'll save you time. Thousands of guys are using it, and I'm still trying to change the industry so that every detailer, at least at some point in their job, uses a tool belt because it just makes sense. Same argument that I've made before. You don't see guys framing a house with a handful of nails and a hammer. Detailers continue to do that. So I would love to get you guys to buy a belt. We're doing some things with our pricing pretty shortly, so watch for that. You'll see it, and I appreciate your support. Go to www.detailershelper.com to order. Follow me on Facebook at Detailers Helper. I'm on Instagram, Detailers Helper Official, or Kevin B. Davis. I'm on there too. So follow me. Hope you guys have a great day, and I hope what I'm doing is helping. I'm Kevin Davis from Detailers Helper, doing what I do so you can do what you do better.